Muy buenas tardes, muchas gracias a todos y todas por seguir aquí con nosotras y por asistir a la conferencia de hoy. Os voy a presentar a Ben Rampton. Ben es es profesor de sociolingüística y de lingüística aplicada. Fue el fundador del Centro de Language, Discourse and Communication, un centro en el que nos miramos también desde Mirko, en el King College. Y él ha tenido también dos papeles importantes en la aglutinación y movilización de los sociolingüistas, como es la lista del Fórum de Linguistic Ethnography y algo que yo valoro mucho, que es el Working Papers in Urban Language and Literacy, como iniciativas de aglutinar y reunir a los sociolingüistas y personas que trabajan en Applied Linguistics. Además, me gustaría hoy destacar dos contribuciones de su trabajo a lo largo del tiempo. La primera de ellas es cómo todo su trabajo para mí confluye en mostrar la flexibilidad y la porosidad de las categorías y de las identidades étnicas, particularmente con Crossing, que muestra cómo para mí son trabajos que van en contra de la esencialización. Y tanto Crossing, ese libro magnífico, como todo el trabajo sobre superdiversidad. Igualmente hay otro punto que para mí creo que es otro pilar de su trabajo y que es importante para nosotros y nosotras, que es el énfasis en la parte analítica, en el mostrar el cómo en la interacción se construyen los procesos sociales. Es decir, no trabajar a veces como a veces hacemos, que saltamos del sustantivo a la exclusión, ¿no? Sino mostrar cómo en la interacción es el locus en el que los procesos sociales se construyen. Y esto es lo que hace que a veces los sociólogos digan que nuestros trabajos son empíricos, en ese sentido que a veces nos llama la atención, pero es ese análisis de grano fino que es el que nos permite conocer bien los procesos. Esta reflexión, los dos elementos están hoy presentes en su presentación y además enlazan con las dos sesiones que quedan todavía por realizar, la que tendremos el lunes y el taller del martes. Entonces, articula mucho todo ello. Y también plantea una cuestión sobre el papel de la lingüística, la sociolingüística, tanto como generadora de conocimientos que a veces son base de gubernamentalidad, como también una fuente o posible camino para las resistencias y para ver las cosas, por lo menos cambiar nuestra visión de algunos procesos, como el de la securitización, que es el que vamos a ver hoy. Así que sin más le doy la palabra a Ben y muchísimas gracias por haber aceptado este reto y esperamos que todo funcione bien. Gracias.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Louisa. Am I coming through okay? Is it clear? Yeah? Yeah, okay. Well, it's a real honor and a pleasure to be involved in this kind of inauguration of the Merco Center. I don't know what the financial investment there is behind the new center, but what's absolutely clear is that this initiative, the Merco initiative, builds on an extraordinarily robust base, and robust in two senses. First, intellectually, the center brings together the very best researchers in critical sociolinguistics. Critical sociolinguistics, well, I don't know whether that would be the term that you'd use, and Louisa and colleagues can tell you much better than me. But there's a clue to what it is in the title of the center. And I notice also that it is Merco, not micro. Okay.
No,
Merco, not micro. It's close, but definitely not just micro. Okay, so that's anyway, extraordinarily robust base. Secondly, the centre is clearly very robust in terms of resourceful commitment. There's a very substantial track record of top-class research underpinning the new centre, but over the decade, it's been threatened and tested by some extremely tough economic conditions. But instead of being disrupted, the research program has adjusted, thrived, developed in the most remarkable way. The original plan was that I would come and give this talk in Madrid, traveling by train. But in a way, Zoom is more appropriate. It fits with Merco's international reach and eminence, and it exemplifies Merco's refusal to submit to challenging conditions. So before I actually start my talk, I would like to say, congratulations to all the people who have participated in this initiative, and I'm really looking forward to seeing all this work surging further forward. So it's a real pleasure and an honor. I've got some PowerPoint slides, and I'll now. I think what I'll do now is I'll go to the PowerPoint through the screen share. Here we are. Let's share that, and I'll go up to this. Yeah. So you can see this. Okay, well, neoliberalism, language and securitization. We often think about security as being a condition of feeling secure, but a lot of political scientists, in the Anglophone world at least, are interested in the processes surrounding security, so that some of them now talk about securitization. Securitization, they say, is a political process that talks about existential threats and calls for exceptional measures to deal with these threats, departing from whatever it is that's seen as the normal political procedures. Securitization in this line of theory can happen in all sorts of different political and economic systems. And I'll start with some reflections on the relationship with neoliberalism, sketching two rather different scenarios. After that, in section 2, I'll briefly compare the discourses of neoliberalism and securitization before going on to describe my own approach to all this, which is interactional sociolinguistics. For interactional sociolinguistics, I think we need to define security processes a little bit differently. And here I'll bring in the notion of insecuritization. If we put interactional sociolinguistics and insecuritization together, I think we'll have quite a good set of tools for investigating the unpredictable ground level effects produced by discourses of security and neoliberalism. In the penultimate section, in section 4, I'll identify 4 insecuritization processes that I think call for more attention, and I'll close by trying to encapsulate the broader value of the type of analysis that I'm proposing. Now, I'm not going to try and define neoliberalism, as there are lots of people here who know much more about the theory than me. But I would like to sketch two scenarios in which neoliberalism and securitization are closely connected. Let's call the first one securitized neoliberalism, with neoliberalism as the main system and securitization as a kind of administrative elaboration. In the metaphor suggested by Wacon, this is the invisible hand of the market mating with the iron fist of the penal state. Prisons are an important part of security. In talking about the US, Wacon says that the penalization of poverty is a core element of the domestic implementation and trans-border diffusion of the neoliberal project. And the penal state, says Wacon, helps it to resolve two dilemmas created by marketization. It curbs the mounting dislocations caused by the normalization of social insecurity at the bottom of the class and urban structure, and it restores the authority of the governing elite by reaffirming law and order just when this authority is being undermined by the accelerating flows of money, capital, signs, and people across national borders, by supranational bodies and financial capital. Turning to the kind of more obviously global dimension of neoliberalism, the transnational movement of people is filtered by processes of bordering, and these are ever expanding, penetrating deep inside the external territorial boundaries of the state. Those near the top don't see the firewall, but the bordering and filtering are increasingly visible and dangerous for those placed lower down the economic and racial hierarchies. Didier Bigot describes this as the ban opticon, and he characterizes this arrangement as a surveillant assemblage that treats migrants and minorities as potential enemies and exceptional risks. Enemies and exceptional risks who need to be watched in ways that go well beyond normal democratic accountabilities. The panopticon is managed by a proliferating transnational archipelago of security experts, police, intelligence, military, immigration control, private companies, specialist lawyers, academics, and so forth. And among other things, these security experts are always seeking to extend the integration of police files with, for example, data from social security, taxis, insurance, credit bureaus, supermarkets, etc. So this is a combination of neoliberalism and securitization that creates the, for example, I think the dual society described by Nancy Fraser, and it involves a hyper-competitive, fully networked zone on the one side, and a marginal sector of excluded low achievers on the other. And it's certainly not just the USA. In the UK, there is also an official cross-government policy called the Hostile Environment for Migrants, and I'll read this out. It intentionally situates asylum seekers and undocumented migrants outside most structures of social inclusion by denying them the right to a safe home, to a decent standard of living, and to physical and mental health and family life, and by continuously controlling their movements through various technologies of everyday bordering. Of course, there are also economic effects. The prospect of deportation means that if undocumented migrants do get work, they can be exploited as cheap, compliant, and dispensable labor. So that's one sketch of the relationship between securitization and neoliberalism. For the glimpse of a different one, a table and a few newspaper headlines are enough, I think. Here's the table with Britain at the top, and here are some of the headlines. How a decade of privatization and cuts exposed England to coronavirus. Tory privatization is at the heart of the UK disastrous coronavirus response. How the libertarian right tries to profit from the pandemic. COVID-19 is quite obviously an existential threat, calling for exceptional measures departing from normal political procedures. But since the focus is on the emergency rather than the socio-economic system where it emerges, let's call that neoliberal securitization rather than securitized neoliberalism. I think there are 3 points to draw out from the comparison of these two scenarios. First, there's a sense in which neoliberalism and securitization lean in different directions. Neoliberalism aims to reduce the role of the state, while securitization usually seeks to increase it. Second, if we take the coronavirus case, I don't think that securitization is always a bad thing. And in the UK, I wish there'd been more securitization of COVID early on. But third, do I really know what I'm talking about here? I mean, I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a criminologist. I'm not an epidemiologist. I've got strong feelings about both of the scenarios I've sketched, but I can't claim to offer an expert overview on either of them. So, but that's not to say I don't think that linguistics is irrelevant. And now I'd like to try and describe the contribution that I think sociolinguistics can make, starting with securitization. So now I'm going on to the next section. In actual fact, the scholars, the European scholars who first developed the notion of securitization, described it as a discursive process. And they drew on a lot of foundational thinkers in linguistic pragmatics, particularly J.L. Austin. And following on from these originators of the concept, scholars in security studies refer to a lot of prominent sociolinguists and discourse analysts. And it's actually quite interesting to compare the discourses of securitization with some of the work that's been done on neoliberalism. Neoliberalism obviously isn't just a set of free market economic policies. It's an ideology and a mode of governance reaching into many different spheres of social life. Well, the same can be said of securitization, as Yuval Davis and other people have made clear in their descriptions of everyday bordering. And we can also see some broad rhetorical parallels in the discourses of securitization and neoliberalism. While neoliberalism is associated with discourses of personal enterprise, innovation, competition, the commodification of language as profit, securitization emphasizes fear and suspicion, places the entrepreneur with the enemy and terrorist as central characters, and conceptualizes language as a shield or a weapon. And indeed, we also shouldn't forget that the term applied linguistics itself, in the Anglophone world, the term applied linguistics emerged from the marriage of Bloomfield's structuralism with language training in the American Army in the 1940s. So just as with neoliberalization, there's a lot of scope for critical analyses of the discourses of securitization. A lot of scope for denaturalizing dominant ideologies, proposing counter-hegemonic alternatives. I'm not sure, though, that that's really enough. And to explain why not, I need to say a bit more about the kind of linguistics that I do, that I engage in. Okay, well, following in the tradition of John Gumpert's, I do interactional sociolinguistics. And I see this as the study of everyday communicative practice in changing social conditions. Interactional sociolinguistics also subscribes to two of the central beliefs in linguistic ethnography communication. The contexts of communication should be investigated, not just assumed. Meaning takes shape among agents with different repertoires and expectations in specific social relations, interactional histories, and institutional regimes, and these need to be grasped ethnographically. Second tenet, second principle, biography, identifications, stance, and nuance are all extensively signaled in the textual fine grain. So analysis of the internal organization of verbal semiotic data reveals much of the participants' position, much of their position and significance in the world. Crucially, this means that you can't take the impact of big cultural discourses, big D discourses like neoliberalism or securitization, you can't take the effect of those discourses for granted. Yes, these discourses have a determining influence on events, but only in the sense of setting limits and exerting pressure, not predicting or totally controlling what actually happens. But what's that got to do with securitization? Well, generally speaking, yes, interactional sociolinguistics is a very good toolbox if you want to study microaggressions based on race, migration background, gender, and so forth. But we can make the links to securitization much more directly when we look at political scientists who study security from the perspective of practice theory. So Huysmans, for example, Huysmans defines securitization as a practice of making enemy and fear the integrative, energetic principles of politics, displacing the democratic principles of freedom and justice. It enacts our world as if it is a dangerous world, a world saturated by insecurities. It invests fear and enmity in relations between humans and polities. The processual, the practice dimension of this is very clear. It's clear in the ization suffix in securitization. But there are extra nuances when we add the bracketed prefix in. Okay, so this gives us in securitization, and this is the formulation used by scholars like Bigot and McCluskey. The bracketed in prefix captures the fact that the effects of these practices are both unstable and relational. Security to one person is insecurity to another, and this may change with the situation, sometimes quite quickly. So, for interactional sociolinguistic purposes, to try to get to the kind of lived experience of securitizing discourses, Constantina Haralambos and I have defined insecuritization as an intensifying apprehension of institutionally authorized vulnerability and existential threat produced and received in communicative practice in a range of social settings. Now, in that definition, the phrase institutionally authorized shows that we're certainly not blind to history or policy, politics, big politics, but the words intensifying apprehension point to the experiential dimensions of security. And to illuminate what this might mean for empirical research itself, let me give you a few examples of the kinds of study that this could lead to. And I'll begin with a very traditional sociolinguistic theme, intercultural communication. Interactional, the scope for empirical sociolinguistic studies of insecuritization. Okay. Interactional sociolinguistics, the approach that I'm advocating, is associated with names like John Gumpertz, Fred Erickson, Celia Roberts, and there is a long tradition of research that analyzes interethnic job interviews. This tradition shows how routine processes of interpretation in these gatekeeping events produce misunderstandings that result in race discrimination and material inequality. And this happens even though the participants aren't overtly prejudiced or intentionally racist. More recently, scholars like Blomert, Marins, Jacome have extended these analyses to asylum application procedures. And here, the stakes are raised from wealth and status stratification to territorial exclusion. But I think now there's a good case for going further. Interactional sociolinguistics now needs to examine everyday bordering, a major practice in securitized neoliberalism. And I'll read this. Everyday bordering has become a major governance technology, controlling diversity and constructing hierarchies of exclusion and exploitation. As such, it affects not only migrants and racialized minorities, and it affects other people, not only when they're actually crossing a border or are in employment in a border zone. Bordering has become a major new citizenship duty and a major influence on social and communal solidarities. In the UK, through the 2014 and 2016 Immigration Acts, landlords, employers, teachers, doctors are responsible for verifying that their tenants, employees, students, and patients are legally in the country, and if they fail, they may be fined or even go to prison, unlike those who are trained and paid to do the job. In fact, it's not just in interethnic encounters that we need to investigate practices of fear and suspicion, as you can see in the work done by Kirsty Ball and colleagues in their ethnography, The Private Security State, Surveillance, Consumer Data, and the War on Terror. This study focuses on travel agencies and financial institutions, and it describes an organizational tension between commercial agendas and security compliance. It shows how security regulations impact on information systems, on stakeholder relationships, on approaches to marketing, and on the experiences of employment in both sectors. In fact, the tension between commercial and security agendas is experienced most sharply by frontline staff who work in customer-facing jobs. It's these frontline staff who experience the non-negotiable threat of criminalized fines for non-compliance. And in the end, it's difficult to disentangle the politics of security from the politics of labor and production. So, everyday bordering and workplace security compliance are two examples of the performance of insecuritizing neoliberalism that call for new interactional sociolinguistic analyses. But to underline the fact that you really can't predict how security as a kind of big cultural discourse is going to affect what happens on the ground, let me refer to some research on security and intercultural communication that we've actually completed. Just now I've been talking about studies that need to be done, but I can now, let me turn on to some work that we've actually done. I think in what I'm going to talk about, you could maybe see neoliberalism in the fact that intercultural skills are often linked to EU mobility and employment opportunities, but we ourselves haven't talked much about neoliberalism in our research. So here, I'd just like to point to some of the ground level unpredictabilities that emerge when you're looking at intercultural communication in a situation that has been profoundly affected by violent conflict. So, as you know, Cyprus, we're going to talk about Cyprus, and Cyprus has been divided for nearly 50 years following war between people aligned with Greece and people aligned with Turkey. But in 2004, as part of the EU accession process, the Greek Cypriot government of the Republic introduced optional Turkish language classes to secondary schools and adult education institutes. This was presented as a reconciliatory gesture of goodwill, giving Greek Cypriots the opportunity to study the hitherto heavily securitized language of their former enemy. In 2006 and 2012-13, we investigated some of the optional secondary school classes, and we found that it was all very different from what you'd expect from the way policymakers talked about language learning and intercultural understanding. A lot of the Greek Cypriot students told us that they never wanted to talk to a Turkish speaker. A few of them even said that they wished that all Turkish speakers were dead. And if the teacher in the class said anything positive about Turkish speaking people, there would be a lot of unruly protest in the class. As one teacher said, "How am I going to practice dialogues in the classroom between salesmen and buyers when students are not supposed to cross to the other side and buy things from the occupied territories?" So what did the teachers do? Well, for the most part, they sanitized. They kind of sterilized, sanitized Turkish by focusing exclusively on grammar and vocabulary. In other words, they promoted intercommunal relations by suppressing the cultural and socio-symbolic dimensions of the Turkish language. Now, there are 3 points to pull out from this. First, on unpredictability, lots of people think foreign language learning involves intercultural relationships, and that good intercultural language teaching involves exposure to the other culture, authentic teaching materials and role-playing exercises, drawing from real life, interaction with native speakers. That might all work in conditions of peace and stability, but we discovered it doesn't necessarily transfer to situations where there has been large-scale violent conflict and where security is a major concern. Second, our interactional sociolinguistic analyses of these classrooms went into quite a lot of detail. But contrary to what you might imagine, this kind of detailed analysis is not dysfunctionally dry or esoteric. Outside sociolinguistics, at least in the UK, the international relations discipline of peace and conflict studies, there's growing interest in the low-key peace-building activity of local people, and some of this work refers to everyday communicative strategies like politeness and avoidance. Our work on Cypriot language classrooms certainly didn't discover any spectacular transformations in students' attitudes. The students didn't all start to support the idea of reconciliation, but we were able to show that language lessons were more effective than educational projects specifically designed as peace education. We also provided a solid empirical description of the role that school language lessons can play as significant early steps towards the modest goals of coexistence and tolerance, in McGinty's words. We've also shown how these lessons undermined the otherwise unquestioned authority of nationalist Turkophobia in the Greek Cypriot school curriculum. So these classes provided adolescents with a kind of first lesson in how to deal with the controversy of the conflict. They called on the students to respect different views and not to overstep the boundaries. And they also compelled individual students to develop explicit justifications explaining why they'd actually developed, explicit justifications explaining why they'd actually chosen Turkish as a language option. So, and we've written this up for the journal Peace Building outside sociolinguistics, and we've been feeding this work into policy work in Cyprus. The third and last point to make is that the Cyprus study shows once again how varied security-related practices can be. And it illustrates how important the different affixes around the word security can be. So actually, in this particular case, we should probably say that these language lessons were desecuritizing Turkish. They tried to pull the language out of the frame of security, bringing it back into ordinary civic life, making it more than just a language for the army and the police. Okay, so that's 3 practices calling for interactional sociolinguistic analysis: everyday bordering, workplace security compliance, and intercultural language teaching in places where there's a legacy of conflict. And of course, don't forget that legacies of conflict aren't confined to countries afflicted by war. People can carry these legacies with them when they migrate, and this can affect the teaching and learning of languages in countries where they move to. But let me give you just one more example of an insecuritizing process that calls for interactional sociolinguistic analysis. And in doing so, I'll point towards a large and still rather untapped resource for this kind of work. Insecuritization is often linked to surveillance, and this is obviously a massive contemporary issue. In fact, scholars often make very, very generalized statements about security surveillance, saying, for example, that it has produced social changes in the dynamics of power, identity, institutional practice, and interpersonal relations on a scale comparable to the changes brought by industrialization, globalizations, or the historical rise of urbanization. But somewhat remarkably, there's hardly any empirical research on what surveillance means for people's everyday experience, either in surveillance studies or in Anglophone sociolinguistics. Somehow or other, people have forgotten, have missed all the work that Irving Goffman did on what he called unfocused interaction. This is the interaction in which we're not directly focused on other people in an activity together, but even so, we're still alert to what's going on around us, and we maintain a kind of side of the eye, half an ear awareness of people, objects, and events in the vicinity, just in case they start to threaten or disrupt what we're doing. The analytical frameworks that Goffman developed for unfocused interaction of this kind can generate rather subtle descriptions of the different ways in which people both perform and respond to surveillance. And again, we've got another paper coming out of this in a non-sociolinguistics journal. but actually, there's just one more thing to say about Goffman. Okay, Goffman's great because his work provides lots of insight into the unpredictable nuances of conduct. And this is really important for the study of insecuritization. But in addition, throughout Goffman's oeuvre, throughout his work, both in his studies of institutions and in his explorations of face-to-face encounters, security and insecurity, risk and threat, mundane routine, and states of exception recur as central themes. The product of all this is an analytical apparatus that's capable of detecting all the different ways in which, even in intensely difficult, conflict, troubled situations, many people still somehow manage to produce livable lives. Exceptional pressures can coexist in intimate proximity with efforts to maintain normality. And the risk is that if you only attend to the dominant discourses, you can miss all this and end up with rather overdetermined demonologies, victimologies, and so forth. Right, let me close now. Let me finish. I've wandered a bit far from the relationship between security and neoliberalism, but let me try and bring them back together again with a final assertion of the value of an interactional sociolinguistic perspective. First, just like ethnography more generally, I think that interactional sociolinguistics can help us avoid totalizing overstatements about epochs and epochal transformation, just as Louisa was saying. Here, I line up with the Foucauldian views of Nicholas Rose, who says that we need to watch closely for the emergence of new control strategies and the reconfiguration of old ones. Some of these control strategies may be associated with neoliberalism and others with insecuritization, but it's hard to predict exactly what their interplay will be, and there may also be other ideologies and technologies of governance at work as well. Second, interactional sociolinguistics has developed some very practical, tried and tested methods of awareness raising, and these involve ordinary people and non-academic professionals sitting down to listen carefully and reflexively to interactions recorded by researchers. Again, these low-key awareness-raising data sessions dovetail quite well with the approach to practical political engagement outlined by Rose. Rose says, the notion of resistance, at least as it's conventionally functioned, is too simple and flattening. Instead, one should examine the much smaller ways in which creativity arises out of the situation of human beings engaged in particular relations of force and meaning, and what is made out of the possibilities of that location. In other words, we need methods of analysis and forms of practical intervention that are capable of penetrating the capillary subtleties in social relations and relations of power. Methods of analysis and forms of practical intervention that not only help to hear the constraints, pressures, and microaggressions enacted in our everyday communication, but also to identify actual and potential reconfigurations. And that's, I think, something we can get from the tradition of Gumpertzian interactional sociolinguistics. So that's my account of insecuritization and some of its links to neoliberalism and the kinds of study that I think now should have a priority. I look forward to hearing what you think. And actually, I did a handout summarizing these slides, but I think at this point I'll stop. They're the reference. You don't see the you don't need to see the references. There you are. They're on the handout. So I'll stop sharing now. So thank you for that. I went on a bit longer, but I didn't know how fast I had to be for the simultaneous translation. I hope you didn't finish the simultaneous translation 5 minutes before I finished speaking. Anyway.
Muchas gracias, Ben, por la presentación y por mostrarnos esta dinámica de la insecuritization and the securitization. Estaba pensando, me venía a la mente una imagen de Wacom de un centauro con la que él representa el neoliberalismo, que tiene una cara amable, aunque manipuladora, con las élites y la clase media, y una parte de la clase media, y una forma bestial con los pobres, con los inmigrantes. Entonces, de manera que se unen ahí neoliberalismo y securitización, porque es a esa parte donde va ese control, ¿no? Y me venía mucho a la mente esta imagen del centauro, y una vez que entendemos, pienso, ¿no? Ahí viene mi pregunta, una vez que entendemos cómo la insecuritización y la securitización no pueden separarse, porque se genera alarma para actuar con las herramientas de la seguridad, nuestra tarea tendrá que ir más allá que describir, ¿no?, este proceso, intentar transformarlo, actuar. ¿Qué podemos hacer desde nuestro trabajo y qué métodos podemos utilizar? Es una pregunta. Para abrir, ahora recogemos el resto de preguntas.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I think the centaur is a little bit of a simplification, and you know, I think the process of securitization, you know, isn't necessarily a bad thing. I wish there had been more securitization around COVID in the UK. I mean, it's you know, we'll be in a very bad way very, very soon. So I think that it's too simple. Now listen, should we do more than describe? Should we do more than describe? Yes, we should do more than describe, but it's a question of where our expertise, our real expertise, lies. And I'm coming to this out of quite a long and active collaboration with people in critical security studies. Didier Bigot, Emma McCluskey, Jeff Heismans, and these people. Now, these people really do have a very sophisticated, multi-dimensional understanding of securitization processes, and they know that to intervene, they have to engage in all sorts of detailed legal arguments. That there are a whole range of battlegrounds for working out what's workable, what isn't workable, what's good, what's bad. You know, it's a really demanding job. Why they wanted to talk to us is that they just didn't have a vocabulary for getting at the nuances and understanding how these processes emerge, how they're interrupted on the ground. And I think that we can, you know, in one way or another, we are trained to pick up those things. So I suppose, you know, can we do more than describe? Yeah, we can do more than describe, but I see, you know, what we have to listen to, we have to talk to other people, okay, and lend what we can do to concepts that they're working with, and see what happens there. They might not actually like the way in which we interpreted securitization. People in international relations, they listen a little bit to us using the term securitization. They think, hang on, that's a bit different. That's going to check, you know, that happens in interdisciplinary dialogue. But Bigot uses Bourdieu's, often invokes Bourdieu's notion of the collective intellectual. I think, we can participate and contribute to the life of the collective intellectual, but where's the value of our particular contribution? And I think it's in the description. Well, yeah, there's more to say about that, because it's not just description, because another thing that we do is we do present an enormous ontological challenge. We can, as you said in your introductory words, Louisa, we do have a different theory of, we can show the social world being reproduced with a level of detail that, people from other social sciences have can only kind of envisage in a rather wooden theoretical way.
Sorry, perdón. Tengo una pregunta que está escrita en inglés. ¿La hago por el canal español? ¿La hago por el canal inglés? Es un problema. Gracias. Thank you. So I have a question in English from Clara. Thinking about the prefix and the suffix in securitization, the following appears right now in the Spanish press. The patient zero of an outbreak in Extremadura in search and a capture is an immigrant from Almería. The origin of this outbreak is a Maghrebi immigrant who arrives on a boat of the coast of Almería who was not tested for coronavirus. I think she wants you to comment, because it's a good example.
Well, the scope for scapegoating with the virus is obviously enormous, and this plays out at all sorts of levels. We've obviously got Trump saying the virus is invented by the Chinese, so it can be lent to all sorts of discourses. But I don't know, what's your account of the relationship between coronavirus and Black Lives Matter? What's your, I mean, these aren't, I mean, it's astonishing, isn't it, that the one thing that interrupts the flow of news, the exclusive focus on the virus, is an anti-racist movement. Now, how they're related, well, I'm interested to hear how you people think, but what you think about that. But so there's a way in which the discourses of solidarity, the discourses of the nation under threat, have been hugely interrupted by a global movement saying, look, these nation states are actually extremely hierarchic, excluding all sorts of people, and profoundly racist. So I would say that the Black Lives Matters movement is kind of, I don't know how that would fit with your interpretation of the case from Extremadura.
Lo que hemos visto nosotras aquí en un poco el análisis que hemos hecho es que lo que es evidente es que esta situación está afectando a los latinos en Estados Unidos, a la población negra en Estados Unidos, como aquí ha afectado mucho a la población gitana, que tampoco podía vivir de sus actividades económicas. Luego son los sectores sociales más golpeados, ¿no? Los que, y evidentemente hay una reacción de esos sectores porque son los que están siendo disciplinados no por la disciplina social, sino por la disciplina militar, ¿no? De todas maneras, tengo la pregunta reformulada de Clara y la voy a leer porque es muy interesante. La pregunta, bueno, iba dirigida a que con la crisis del coronavirus ha habido mucho debate sobre fake news, lo de es una gripe, etcétera, pero no sobre titulares como estos que he leído yo antes, que son falsos, pero que no son falsos, pero sí muy sesgados y que están creando una inseguridad en un sentido concreto, o una visión en un sentido concreto. ¿Cómo incrementar, ¿no? Rising awareness, cómo incrementar la conciencia de la gente hacia estos tipos de discursos?
Well, I mean, I couldn't say in the Spanish context, but in the United Kingdom, in the amount of reading, the number of books on racism that people have been reading is just astonishing. The best-selling book this year is a book by a woman who about why I no longer talk to white people about racism. So in terms of fighting the kinds of representation in that news report, well, there's a very, an extraordinary explosion of anti-racist awareness and talk about racism. So it's as if the nation states, the discourse, the nation state's domination of the discourse has been seized away from it. It's been seized away, and people are saying, no, let's not pretend that you're looking after us. And plus, this goes back centuries, and that's and if you're looking at it like that, well, I think the people would say for that newspaper report, yeah, that's another example of exactly that. But I don't know how that would play in Spain, obviously. Yeah.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Ben, por tu conferencia. Juanra nos pregunta si piensas que estos procesos de securitización e insecuritización pueden ser vistos como resultado de un discurso doble, es decir, una mezcla entre el discurso neoliberal dominante y el discurso tradicional más conservador. Y en relación también con esta pregunta, nos dice si podríamos profundizar un poco más en el proceso de mercantilización del sistema penal en el Reino Unido, porque a él le parece que lo que está sucediendo ahora en España es un primer paso hacia el escenario del Reino Unido. Muchas gracias.
I mean, I think those questions really draw me outside my areas of expertise. The marketization of the prison system. The only thing I would say is that the probation service in the UK is now being renationalized. It's now being renationalized. How far securitization emerges as a duel between conservative factions and neoliberal marketeers? Well, these guys that we've been talking to, these guys that we've been talking to in security studies, in critical security studies, I mean, they do a lot of work inside Frontex, for example. They go and they do organizational ethnographies, and they would be able to tell you exactly what the lie of different forces is in those organizations. Okay, so I mean, I don't have I don't have the skills to answer that question, but I'd also suggest that if you take a kind of assemblage, an assemblage view of the security apparatus, then you'd need to go and look at all sorts of complicated pressures. And actually, it's only when you understand those kinds of pressures, I think, those different lines of force, those connections, that maybe you can start to change things. But that's a lot of hard practical work in government offices elsewhere. So, I mean, I think that my answer may be a bit of a disappointment, but I think it's the honest one from my point of view, given my particular skill set. Which is not to say that it's not an important and interesting question. Which is not to say that it's not an important and interesting. It is, okay. But answering it, you know, it's very easy for somebody like me to end up being rather a bore, saying it's more complicated than that. It's more complicated than that, you know. So it's that tension between being interested and yeah.
Hola, Ben. Bueno, voy a formularte una pregunta que hace Antonio. Muchas gracias por la presentación. Me ha parecido muy sorprendente cómo las clases de turco se han mostrado más efectivas que los proyectos expresamente dedicados a la educación para la paz. Creo que muestra el gran potencial de las lenguas extranjeras en realidad. ¿Usted qué opina sobre el impacto del inglés al ser enseñado como una segunda lengua, especialmente como un soporte de las ideas neoliberales?
Well, I think that's very interesting, and I think you're right that language has enormous potential, partly because it can be taken in so many different ways. It can mean, you know, in those classrooms, they had vocabulary items and they had sentence patterns, and they focused on the, you know, the affixes and the suffixes and the sentence patterns. And some of the students were thinking, gosh, you know, this is useful for my future in the security services. Other students were thinking, oh, this is great when I go and buy cigarettes, cheaper cigarettes over the. They could invest it with all sorts of different dreams. As a, you know, English and neoliberalism. Well, I teach. I'm part of. I don't work fully anymore at the university. I also do some. Kind of language. I'm a volunteer in some language classes for migrants, refugees, and so forth in London. And it's, the organization is called English for Action, and it is linked to Citizens UK and does community organizing and things like that. I mean, I haven't been doing any of that, but that happens in the class. And the conversations that we have really fascinating conversations. But what's the justification for this? how do you get all these people with different backgrounds coming in to have these conversations? Well, the notion that they have to learn English. So there's something about learning a language. I'm going to learn a language, which is a culturally recognized practice, which allows people to congregate in all sorts of different ways and have discussions that they wouldn't be able to. I mean, there are other groups that do this kind of conversational clubs that are organized around gender. So there are women's groups. There's a group called Xenia, for example, very, very good, and they meet, you know, once a week. And there you have white women talking to migrant women, and the key uniting thing is gender, is women's experiences. Well, the class that I don't do doesn't have gender, but language itself is a pretext, provides a pretext for people to talk in ways they might not usually do so. Of course, when it's, you know, connected to a large thing like Oxford University Press and the British Council, it becomes something different. But you know, I think the spirit of my presentation is to say, yes, those things do happen, but still, the complexity and the scope for people to develop in directions in different in counter hegemonic directions is quite considerable. So that's my I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, and yeah.
Gracias. Tenemos una pregunta de Diana que es a propósito del análisis. Dice, la pregunta es, si nos centramos en un fine-grained análisis, en un fino, como es en la preposición in, ¿perdemos la visión global de la interacción? ¿Cómo se compatibiliza la visión global y el fine-grained, grano fino?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's either or. I don't think it's either or. And the concept that I like is a concept that North American linguistic anthropologists use. It comes from Gumpert. It's something that Gumpert does, but it's been formalized by Michael Silverstein, and he calls it the total linguistic fact. Okay, the total linguistic fact consists of three elements. Okay, yes, linguistic form, structures, you know, formal grammatical structures, situated interaction, people doing things together, but then also ideologies. And these three things are always happening in any bit of linguistic practice. And for two people, you know, and for people to be able to talk, they have to be able to match up their models of the world, of the social world beyond the encounter in the here and now. Okay, that's so, you know, we don't just do the micro. We're doing the macro in our heads at the same time. And of course, what are the resources that are coming into the interaction that we have together? That, you know, what we're doing together is drawing on resources that have already been shaped in particular ways. The materials, the writing materials, the spaces that we're using, the genres that we're using, these are also shaped in elsewhere. So, I mean, and what happens as a result? What in the end, we have an interaction. What happens afterwards? What happens to the products of our of our talk together in the notionally micro. So I think I would go for what people call a flat ontology. You know, that you don't have a high up here micro and a low down here high up here macro and a low down here micro. What you have is a whole range of things coming from the past into the present in all sorts of different places, and we're acting on them, acting against them, reproducing them, pushing them forward. Of course, there are some institutions that are more powerful. There are certain centers that can orchestrate what we do, that can orchestrate what we do in particular directions. And there are other people who are really way off the tracks, and whatever they do, nobody notices, nobody hears. But I think this, you know, it's a question of networks. Let's say networks rather than pyramids. You know, networks and flows rather than pyramids. And that's how I would approach the. I would say that you can unpack the what people have traditionally called the macro. I think this is I think this is actually. I mean, I don't think I'm saying anything particularly new in this. I just looked at Jan Blommert's book, Durkheim and the Internet. You know, that's another restatement of this perspective, and it's yeah.
Muchas gracias, Ben. Nos pregunta Adil en relación con las políticas de securitización, si están o no conectadas con el régimen de uso de las lenguas en el espacio público. Y él pone algunos ejemplos como la interpelación continua de la policía sobre el no uso de algunas lenguas o la autoprohibición del uso de algunas lenguas que se relacionan con el terrorismo. Muchas gracias.
Well, yes, I mean, undoubtedly. But again, I would say to you, this goes so deep, it's so extensive that we really do need to get a close-up look at how it's happening. I mean, every day you go out into the street, every day you look in one direction, but you're also aware of things around you, okay? Okay, you hear sounds, okay? So you're perpetually monitoring what's some things, and there are other people doing the same thing. A lot of those you just ignore, or some things you think, oh, it's great. I feel safer. Here because there is, you know, there's a person. There is. I feel safer at this station, at this railway station, because there is a person in the ticket office. Okay, there's a person in the ticket office selling tickets. It's not just a machine. Now, that person in the ticket office is doing a job of surveillance. Okay, and people have argued that we need more people in ticket offices selling tickets in London Underground because it makes them safer. Okay, so they have a security role. Okay. Now, that's of course, that's one example of a kind of benign surveillance. There are lots of malign forms of surveillance, of course, but the boundary line isn't that clear. It's being surveilled is an interactional practice. You know, and it's something we know how to do. We know how to be surveilled. We know how to conduct ourselves, and it, you know, to make claims about it. I mean, gosh, what a lot of boring answers I'm given. What a lot of non answers. I'm doing exactly. Gosh. But no, because this kind of analysis is an analysis that resonates with people who are most closely involved. It really does resonate with people who are most closely involved. You know, they might be office workers. they might be teachers, they might be, you play them some interaction, you play them a recording of what's going on, and you know, out of their listening you get an extraordinary vivid sense of, wow, that is a particular point of there is a microaggression, there is a regular point where microaggressions happen. Actually, we could redesign this event in a way that these kind of microaggressions were are avoided. So, you know, I don't know that it's a very helpful perspective when it comes to designing policies, you know, institutional policies, and you know, people do have to design policies, are really important, and I don't know that the perspective that I'm talking about is very helpful for people who've got to design policies. But at the same time, I'd also say that if anybody who does policy doesn't listen to the kinds of the ways those policies impact and are taken up on the ground, they're going to run into difficulties. So yeah, I think there is a place, I think there is an important place for this small kind of analysis in a larger arena, and our job is both to do those small analyses and to appreciate how important those analyses are for people's discussions on a larger of a larger scale processes. So that is, you know, that's becoming a mobilized activist bore, okay, if you like. So anyway, okay.
Gracias. Paso a hacerte otra pregunta. Nos pregunta María Casado. Securitización y desecuritización han sido descritos como gemelos conceptuales. Sin embargo, no hay una teoría de la desecuritización de la misma manera en que sí hay una teoría de la securitización. El mismo Weber consideró la desecuritización más importante que la securitización. La pregunta es, ¿cuál es el papel que queda para la desecuritización en la agenda de investigación? ¿No sería útil desarrollar el concepto para abordar asuntos como el aumento de las desigualdades o la violencia? Gracias.
Well, I think that's a really good question, and it's something that people in international relations, you know, that we have this interdisciplinary dialogue, and they say, you know, you're right, there isn't any discussion of desecuritization. At the same time, the people that in security studies that we talk to most do kind of anthropological studies, and they say that, well, desecuritization, securitization, you know, a lot of the discussions in international relations are very, very abstract, and they like this notion of insecuritization, which flags up an issue but leaves it open for people to watch how it happens. I think in terms of alerting people to security, insecurity, the term insecuritization is probably enough. Whether it turns out to be desecuritization or whatever is something that could be studied, analyzed in particular problem situations. And it might well be a helpful term. It was helpful for us. It was helpful. The notion of desecuritization was helpful for us when it came to those language, those Turkish language classrooms. But people in international relations, we've talked quite a lot to people in international. They don't like it. They don't like what we've done. you know. So I don't know about the term insecuritization, what life it could have. We found it quite helpful in our limited study.
Thank you. Gracias. Bueno, tenemos una pregunta de Jackie Urla, que está también en inglés. Voy a hacerla, perdonad, es que ahora no la encuentro. Está en el chat, ¿no? Ahí es, aquí. La hago en inglés, ¿de acuerdo? This talk makes it clear how important it is to take into account the strategies of securitization play in neoliberalism, showing us that there are vastly different species of this system. The middle class student enjoying to become an entrepreneur of herself versus the immigrant who is subjected to systems of continual and repressive surveillance. Neoliberal governmentality is said to rely on freedom, and yet how much freedom does the underclass have?
I mean, yes, I agree, and it takes us back to the image of the centaur that Louisa mentioned at the start. Yes. I mean, you're right. You're right. There's no question. And this is action that. This situation is a situation that calls for political, serious traditional politics. It calls for political mobilization. It calls for action in whatever arenas are possible. Yeah, activism, community activism, political activism, and so forth. Okay. At the same time, it's easy sometimes to forget the agency of people's resourcefulness and their agency, and I think that one of the things that analysis can do is show that as well. Indeed, if governmentality, if Foucault's right about how power works, then you've got to look at the struggle. You've got to look at struggle, where people do have a degree of a bit of room for maneuver, and I think that's important for analysis, and it's important politically. It's important politically as well. I mean, what I would be kind of concerned would be if analysis only was entirely dictated by the image of the centaur, because I think that is a reification. It's true, and big politics needs to address it, and. In the non-academic side of my work, I do, like lots and lots of other people, I do bits and support that. But that there's a difference between that and describing social action and how the world is continuously reproduced, resisted, and so forth. And I think that's also an important task, because you don't want to. I don't think what we should either end up prematurely demonizing people or romanticizing or pitying from the vantage, from the position of the researcher.
Gracias, Ben. Vamos cerrando el turno de preguntas para no abusar de Marcelo. Nos pregunta Julio Morales si es posible que la securitización esté siendo utilizada como una herramienta por los gobiernos neoliberales, como por ejemplo en Latinoamérica, para producir y reproducir ciertas políticas que contribuyen a mantener algunas formas de marginalización y de pobreza crónica. Gracias.
Well, I mean, I would think so. Yes, I'm sure. And of course, what I would also say is that, you know, the Journal of Sociolinguistics had a dialogue session about securitization, insecuritization. Well, you know, we're a bit late. I mean, and me, you know, an academic based in London, I'm coming a bit late to this concept, because actually it's been insecuritization has been states of violence and so forth have been, you know, an active process in all sorts of different places in the world. And in a way, the work that I'm doing is just a little bit of catch up, you know, Anglophone, sociolinguistics, catching up. And as I say, the kind of work that I do focuses on everyday communication. I think it does knock on the doors of my comfortable office at work. You know, it is something I do. I am told to take a register of all my students to check that they're all there and send it to our departmental office, which will then send it to. So, you know, we are being pressured. Everyday bordering, the bordering process has invaded my daily experience in a way that it didn't 15, 20 years ago. So I think, you know, it's fair for me to start talking about it now because it does affect my daily practice. But, you know, people in other parts of the world have, you know, lived and understand processes of insecuritization much better than Anglophone sociolinguists who are now trying to do a bit of catch up, I would say.
Bueno, paso ya con la última pregunta. Es de Clara. Dice que, bueno, quizás no lo he entendido bien, pero el que haya una persona en la taquilla del metro, ¿nos da más libertad ponernos nosotros la gasolina, cobrarnos nosotros la compra en el supermercado? ¿O es una forma plenamente neoliberal de prescindir de personas?
Well, getting rid of people in ticket offices is certainly a cost-cutting move. It's cheaper and means that the railways generate a bit more profit, okay? So they prefer to have machines, yes. Do I feel safer do people feel safer if there's a person selling the tickets? I think they do. You know, they're not alone at night. They're not alone at night on an empty platform. There's somebody there, so if somebody comes and bothers them, they can. There's somebody watching who can raise the alarm, and I think that's you know, that kind of security seems to me a good thing. That's you know, and I think the police, you need a police force. I don't think there's police, of course, do terrible things and overstep what they do, but I'm not. Have I answered that question properly? I think. I mean, it's a difficult. It's a slightly difficult question to answer because, on the one hand, I'm talking about the what these policies mean for people at 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock at night in a railway station in the suburbs, what it means for them, and on the other, we're talking about the railway companies' economic policies. And you know, where do you want to use the word neoliberalism? Where do you want to use the it's I would have said it's not easy to use it in both in both areas, or at least you have to do quite a lot of translation to get from the one to the other.
Muchas gracias, Ben. Vamos a terminar ya porque nuestro intérprete lleva ya más de hora y media trabajando. Te queremos dar mucho las gracias, ha sido muy, muy útil, conecta muy bien con todo el contenido del seminario, aporta ese doble, la discusión nos ha abierto un poco más a profundizar en cuál es el papel de la lingüística aplicada, de la sociolingüística a la hora de construir, justificar o cuestionar una racionalidad neoliberal, y al mismo tiempo cómo se puede entender y analizar estos procesos de insecuritización y desecuritización. Así que te damos las gracias y yo creo que queda muy bien introducida la próxima sesión que tendremos, que es ya el lunes, y cada vez vamos acercándonos más a la cuestión lingüística y luego a la parte analítica que se trabajará en el taller. Entonces el lunes os esperamos, no nos falléis, y seguimos discutiendo. Ya nos centraremos en la lengua, en los sujetos neoliberales, y además captaremos esta no es contradicción, pero este amplio abanico que incluye a los estudiantes elitistas de los bachilleratos internacionales o los estudiantes universitarios de títulos de élite, y al mismo tiempo veremos también con el trabajo de Del Percho, pues cómo afecta todo esto a los sin techo, a los refugiados, de manera que con el próximo día cubriremos estos dos facetas del neoliberalismo y la securitización. Muchas gracias a todos y todas, y si hay alguna cuestión al margen luego sobre Google, etcétera, pues seguimos hablando. Gracias.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Gracias a todos.